Hi, and welcome to a Harry Potter theory. I'm assuming this isn't your first time, sorry. But let me quickly summarize how these videos usually go down. An interesting and maybe even slightly outlandish idea is presented by the theorist, in this case, me. They go on to explain why this idea makes sense given the characters and the story, etc. And then finally, use the canon material to prove why this must be the case. That's it. You're expecting some sort of joke here? Yeah, you're right. You see, with Harry Potter, there's a little bit of a debate over what this final point entails. On the one hand, you have the books, which are canon. I don't think anyone's debating that. They might be, I haven't checked in a while. And then on the other, you have the films, which are based off the books, but then also add and remove and just change things altogether at times. Most people agree that they're not, but some will argue that small details included in the films that don't affect the book's canon should also be considered canon. And then there's the whole fiasco with the Fantastic Beasts films, which are based off new original stories written by J.K. Rowling, so surely they should be, but then... yeah, I say they are, but not everyone agrees on it, and there are some timeline inconsistencies, so I can see both sides. There's also wizardingworld.com. It just doesn't roll off the tongue in the same way, which is just made up of extra details and little stories written by J.K. Rowling, and of course, finally, you have her Twitter account, which she has a bit of a reputation for. Anyway, the reason I bring this all up is because for this theory, I'm kind of throwing out the rulebook. You see, Mrs Norris, the subject of this video, has been confirmed by J.K. Rowling not to be magical in any way. Firstly, on her original website, as in before Pottermore. BP, I know, it's a completely different era, ancient history. In response to someone suggesting Mrs. Norris is an unregistered animagus, she said no, she's just an intelligent and unpleasant cat. Also, more recently on Twitter, she confirmed that Mrs. Norris isn't even a kneazle, unlike Crookshanks. Just for the record, a kneazle is, according to Fantastic Beasts and Where to Find Them, as in the book, a small cat-like creature with flecked, speckled, or spotted fur. The kneazle is intelligent, independent, and occasionally aggressive, though if it takes a liking to a witch or wizard, it makes an excellent pet. So basically, a magic cat. Honestly, I don't know how you managed to take 2 paragraphs to say that. Magic cat. Literally 2 words. However, despite these statements, if you've read the books, I'm sure you'll agree that there's something a bit off about Mrs. Norris, and the idea of her just being an unpleasant cat just isn't satisfying enough. So today I'm going to be going through all the reasons why Mrs. Norris is anything but that, despite what J.K. Rowling has said. This is what you signed up to watch. Now is your chance to click away. You've made your choice. And I guess to start, we need to go through all the other things she could potentially be. You've got an animagus, which I personally think is unlikely, because then she could just change back and forth, and it'd be a bit weird that we never saw her in her human form, or that no one knew. Like, say J.K. Rowling came out and said that tomorrow, I would feel like it's a bit of a retcon, and would probably be quite annoyed. I guess technically it could be a failed animagus where she got stuck in her animal form, but we don't know one case of this ever happening, so I don't know if you can be a failed animagus. Like, the closest example is a maledictus, which was only recently confirmed to exist in the Harry Potter universe with the Fantastic Beasts films, so it might go against what I'm trying to do here, but I do like the idea that she could have once been a human, so for that I'm going to include it. She could also be a magic cat. I mean, a kneazle. But you knew what I meant, didn't you? This is the most simple solution, but also probably the most likely. And finally, there's a familiar, which is an animal that exists in British folklore said to serve a witch in various ways, whether as servants, messengers, or spies. While there are a few issues, I'm gonna get back into which of these theories work best later. For now, let's dig into the canon. Starting with the first ever description of Mrs. Norris, which is that she's a scrawny, dust-colored creature with bulging lamp-like eyes, just like Filch's. So the glaringly peculiar thing to take from this is that her eyes are just like Filch's, which I think is a massive point in favor of her once being human, specifically a relative of Argus. Oof, that felt weird. Never call Filch Argus, guys. Just, it's wrong. Because, I mean, the chances of your pet just happening to look surprisingly like you, I'm saying it's unlikely. Alongside that, she's described as scrawny, which fits up nicely with the fact kneazles are described as small, and the cat in the image kinda looks scrawny as well. So appearance-wise, she could be a kneazle. And in the case of a familiar, she's a cat, so animal. From there, a few pages later, Hagrid files the first of many complaints about Mrs. Norris throughout the series. Do you know, every time I go up to the school, she follows me everywhere. Can't get rid of her. Filch puts her up to it. She follows him around. Is it normal for cats to follow you around? Okay, apparently it's normal for cats to do that with their owners, which Hagrid is not, surprisingly. He owns pretty much every other animal in Hogwarts, other than the students' animals. And then, he technically doesn't own the animals in the forest. He owns Fang, and Norberta for a bit, and Aragog for a bit. Point is, Mrs. Norris following him around is weird, as is the fact Filch would have the ability to put her up to that. Because I've been reading up about cats, and while you can train them to use a toilet bowl, give high fives, and maybe even follow their owner around, nowhere does it say you can train them to follow someone else around. Like, what would you even say? I've never owned a cat before, and maybe that's showing, so I decided to ask someone who has. Let me introduce cat expert and I guess kind of a Harry Potter fan, Cherry Wallace.
You don't think it's possible, do you?
No, you can train a cat to like follow you around, because some cats do, because they're needy. You cannot train a cat to be like, go follow Sophie around a flat.
Follow Hagrid around, like...
Unfortunately, Chris, Cherry's cameraman, editor, videographer, self-impersonator, sarcasm enthusiast, and life partner of another cat expert, decided to intervene.
Ross is saying that it is if you so like there is a cat on Instagram called Suki Cat who's been brought up on lead.
Yeah.
And it is entirely possible you could train a cat to do that.
And then went on to conclude that despite the fact Mrs Norris is played by a Maine Coon in the films, in the books her description lines up more appropriately with a Cornish Rex. I don't know how he got here, and while the Cornish Rex is a relatively intelligent breed of cat, I still think this is out of the ordinary, and for that reason, I think it would make more sense if she was magical in some way. For example, if she was once human, obeying a command to follow Hagrid around wouldn't be that complicated to understand. Same with being a kneazle, who are described to have an uncanny ability to detect unsavory or suspicious characters. And then finally, a familiar, almost too perfectly, can literally be used as a spy. I mean, I'm guessing she's spying on Hagrid. I don't know why else she'd be following him around. Her next mention comes when Harry, Ron, and Neville are sneaking around the Hogwarts castle after Malfoy challenged Harry to a midnight duel. Filch is overheard saying, "Sniff around, my sweet. They might be lurking in a corner." And while cats do have a notably strong sense of smell, this is a very specific order. Something I feel the need to address because her understanding of the English language is way beyond the ability of what it should be. Also, Filch called her his sweet, which almost sounds romantic, and I mean, I don't know, maybe that's just the way he refers to his pet. I just thought it was strange, and I can't wait to get hundreds of comments telling me how it isn't strange, and I'm strange for thinking it's strange because people also call their pets sweet, but before you even bother, I don't care enough, so it's really not worth it. And finally, for the first book, yeah, we're just getting started. There are two instances where Mrs Norris appears to just look through the invisibility cloak. Ron threw the cloak back over them as the luminous eyes of Mrs Norris came round the door. Ron and Harry stood quite still, both thinking the same thing. Did the cloak work on cats? As they climbed carefully around her, Mrs Norris turned her lamp-like eyes on them, but didn't do anything. Which again, not normal. This is the perfect invisibility cloak, one of the Deathly Hallows. The only other examples of a character being able to see through it is when they're literally using a spell or have a magic eye, which is probably made up using incantations similar to that spell. If you hadn't noticed, there's a correlation between these two things. Magic. Now, whether any of the magical creatures I'm speculating she could be can do this is unclear, and I'm assuming they probably can't. But familiars are said to be credited with supernatural gifts, so yeah, whatever that means. Looking through invisibility cloaks? Maybe? Probably not, but it's still worth pointing out. And that's what brings us on to the Chamber of Secrets, where, get this, her first inclusion in the entire book. Right, said Harry, backing away from the accusing stare of Mrs Norris, but not quickly enough. Drawn to the spot by the mysterious power that seemed to connect him with his foul cat, Argus Filch burst suddenly through a tapestry to Harry's right. Mysterious power. But don't worry, she's just an ordinary cat. J.K. Rowling said it a few years later. However, since we're trying to prove she's magic, it's probably important to define what that means. And according to Google, it's the power of apparently influencing events by using mysterious or supernatural forces. If only it was right in front of us. Oh well, making unnecessary long videos, analysing things and tackling questions no one ever asked is rewarding in other ways. I'll think of one. Anyway, as I'm sure you know, Mrs Norris gets petrified in the Chamber of Secrets, the most interesting thing that happens to her throughout the series. Not even starting to think about the repercussions of what this means about her. Firstly, the basilisk was only known to attack Muggle-borns. Myrtle Warren, Colin Creevey, Justin Finch-Fletchley, Hermione Granger, Penelope Clearwater, all Muggle-born. The only other known victim is Nearly Headless Nick, and while we don't know what his lineage is, we do know that he was knighted by the king, who I think is a Muggle, to our knowledge, showing he was associated with Muggles, and therefore it would fit up for him to also be Muggle-born. Meaning it would bode well, and the basilisk attack would make more sense if Mrs Norris had once been a Muggle-born witch, or a Muggle-born kneazle. I say this with the knowledge that kneazles are magic cats, and we know they can interbreed with non-magic cats, and therefore it's only fair to assume there can be Muggle-born kneazles. Same with being pure-blooded and half-blooded. I assume it works the same way as humans, because, well, we're both mammals, so I don't see why it would work any differently. Providing evidence that Mrs Norris could be a Muggle-born kneazle. Bet you never thought you'd see anyone come to that conclusion, did ya? Also, since there are obviously no examples of any Muggles getting petrified, we don't even know if it's possible for non-magic beings to get petrified. Given the cure for petrification is a mandrake restorative draught, a magical potion, would it even work? It's worth noting that in all of the Harry Potter books, there is not one example of a magic potion being used to heal a non-magic person. Which honestly makes sense. They're not magical, so why would it even work? I mean, technically there are examples in the Tales of Beedle the Bard and Fantastic Beasts and Where to Find Them, and I personally probably think it would work because, I mean, you can do spells on them, which is kind of different. I don't know, it's similar. But I bring this up to say that there is no evidence of potions working on muggles in the books, let alone it being possible for them to get petrified. So it seems to be the logical conclusion to assume that Mrs Norris is magical in some way. And with her being petrified for the remainder of that book, I guess it's time to move on to the Prisoner of Azkaban, where she's first noticed on the Marauders map. It was a map showing every detail of the Hogwarts castle and grounds, but the truly remarkable thing was the tiny ink dots moving around it, each labelled with a name in minuscule writing. Astounded, Harry bent over it. A labelled dot in the top left corner showed that Professor Dumbledore was pacing in his study. The caretaker's cat, Mrs Norris, was prowling the second floor, and Peeves the poltergeist was currently bouncing around the trophy room. I find this extremely interesting because she is officially the only animal ever said to feature on the map, other than when Lupin spots Wormtail, but say it with me, he's an animagus! I wonder if there is a correlation there. Even the ghosts, the only other non-human things to appear on the map, were notably all human at one point, because they're ghosts. And this would seem to definitively confirm that there is something different about Mrs Norris, proving that she was a human at one point. And while there is the argument that it's never actually confirmed she's the only animal on the map, I don't know why that would ever get said in the books. It's weird there are no animals on this map, said Harry. I feel like other animals appearing would just make the map too crowded and less useful, which really is just taking away from James, Remus, Sirius, and Peter's achievements, which don't do that. Hater. On the contrary, you could argue that they were just so concise when making the map, they added Mrs Norris in so they could track her whereabouts while they were being troublesome. But then, considering James is Harry's dad and therefore must have gone to school in the 70s, and Mrs Norris is still alive in the Deathly Hallows in 1998, that's when no ordinary cat can live that long. Meaning, if that was the case and she was in fact alive when the Marauders went to Hogwarts, that would just further prove that she is, I'm running out of ways to say this, magical. And one more final thing, which should be taken with a grain of salt for this video because it is off Pottermore, which I said I wouldn't use. But apparently, the name for the spell used by the Marauders to make the map was called the Homunculus Charm, which I think is worth noting because homo literally means man, and the Latin word homunculus, which this is changed one letter from, is a representation of a small human being. This spell, by definition, is used for displaying humans. Except for Mrs Norris, who apparently isn't one. Apparently. So there are fewer and fewer mentions of Mrs Norris as the books go on, and because of that, the Goblet of Fire doesn't really provide us with any new information. Other than in the film, when Filch slow dances with her, which... yeah, it's weird. Other than that, she's seen on the Marauders map again, Filch describes it as his suite again, and she seems to look through the invisibility cloak again. Mrs Norris's lamp-like eyes, so very like her master's, were fixed directly upon Harry. He had had occasion before now to wonder whether the invisibility cloak worked on cats. There's something we haven't discussed already, so I'm going to move on to the Order of the Phoenix, where Harry first encounters Mrs Norris while going up to the Owlery, and she's described as having the unmistakable air of a cat that was off to report to her boss, which is very weirdly specific, and surely then implying how often she must run off only to have Filch come running in moments later. And you guessed it, literally one page later, Filch the caretaker came wheezing into the room and says, "I've had a tip-off that you're intending to place a massive order for dung bombs." This line always catches me off guard, like, is it implying that Mrs Norris tipped him off? Because how did she communicate that? Everything about her would make more sense if she could just speak English. Of course, it's implied she can't because she's a cat. However, I guess maybe someone else tipped him off, so he sent Mrs Norris to patrol the Owlery, and then when she saw Harry, who she caught misbehaving like 4 years ago, like, she only caught him once, and she clearly remembered it, and then went back to find Filch, who she must have found within the space of like a minute, communicated that Harry was in the Owlery, only for Filch to come running back within the space of about a minute as well. And yeah, I'm sorry, but no matter how intelligent, no cat could have worked that out. I struggled to work that all out. That took me like 100 takes. However, I guess maybe someone else did. And I don't want to brag, but I consider myself to be more intelligent than most cats. There's also an interaction between Professor McGonagall and Mrs Norris in this book, which makes for quite interesting reading, with McGonagall being a cat animagus. And if there's anyone who might know of Mrs Norris's secrets other than Filch, it would be her, since animaguses are known to be able to communicate with other animals of the kind they can turn into. We know this because of, well, Voldemort, actually, of all people, who confirmed that Wormtail can communicate with rats. He sought me in the country where it had long been rumoured I was hiding, helped of course by the rats he met along the way. Wormtail has a curious affinity with rats, do you not, Wormtail? Applying this logic to McGonagall and Mrs Norris, it would only be fair to assume that they had a conversation in cat form at some point during their time in the castle, which was at least 7 years. Unfortunately, the only look we get into any sort of relationship between them is they passed Mrs Norris, who turned her lamp-like eyes upon them and hissed faintly. Professor McGonagall said shoo. While I can see the argument that her saying shoo almost implies that Mrs Norris is a lesser being, when you actually stop to think about the animagus form and the connection animaguses have with the animal they become, Wormtail once again was notably able to get rats to work together for his own benefit. And I can only imagine McGonagall is even more powerful considering her knowledge in transformation, giving her an even stronger connection and most likely respect for cats. So therefore, saying shoo would be incredibly out of character for her, as I'm assuming that is disrespectful, implying that they don't get along for some reason. Well, you might think, of course they don't get along. She's Mrs Norris, Filch's unpleasant cat.
They are supposed to be out of bed, you blithering idiot.
And I don't know, maybe I'm reading into it too much. I'm pretty sure I'm reading into it too much, but it seems to give off some deeper tension and dislike between the characters, which would only really feel possible if she had enough of a personality to be dislikable. Like seriously, how much can you really dislike an ordinary cat? They're not that smart, like what are they gonna do? Which is all working in favor of her being some sort of magical cat. Leading me on to the final 2 books where she isn't really mentioned much. In The Half-Blood Prince, she features 3 times, and they're all to do with her appearing in some way. It does say that Mrs Norris had arrived unseen, and I don't know if that proves she has some supernatural power where she can disappear and appear at will, or if it's just saying she appeared and no one noticed her. Probably the latter. And then in the Deathly Hallows, she's mentioned even less. Once, to be precise. Along yet another corridor he dashed, and then there were owls everywhere, and Mrs Norris was hissing and trying to bat them with her paws, no doubt to return them to their proper place. Yeah, there isn't really much in terms of new information, and I guess that kind of rounds things off. I think there is definitive evidence throughout the books that Mrs Norris is some sort of magical being. This is the longest theory video I've ever made, purely because there was just so much evidence, and I guess the only other question is, what do I think she actually is? So let's start with the least likely. I don't think she's a familiar. While I do think it fits up very well with J.K. Rowling even admitting that, ironically, the animal that acts most like a familiar in the series is Mrs Norris, almost as if she was written like a magical character. But since they aren't mentioned in the books, we have no proof they exist in the universe, something J.K. Rowling has also confirmed, saying they do not exist within the world of Harry Potter. And for that reason, I'm going to say she's not one. However, when it comes to the other 2 or 3 things, being a failed animagus / maledictus-like creature or a kneazle, it's really just a coin toss to decide which one works best. Turns out Mrs Norris was actually just the queen this entire time. More her once being a human would pretty much help explain everything about her character, including her appearance on the Marauders map, her weird name, which I haven't addressed yet, but Mrs Norris is a weird name for a cat. Why her appearance resembles Filch, how she can understand English so well. It goes on. And if we knew you could become a failed animagus or maledicti were literally mentioned once throughout the books, I'd be 100% sure of this. But because they aren't, a kneazle provides itself as a strong alternative to explain these unusual character traits. My headcanon is that she's a maledictus and has been ever since Fantastic Beasts came out, because I personally consider it canon, and I'm sure some people are going to disagree with that, but if there's one thing we can all agree on, it's that she's anything but just an intelligent and unpleasant cat. Oh my god, guys, this video took forever. So thank you so much for watching it all the way to the end. And if you enjoy these kind of in-depth and long theory videos, make sure to leave a like so I know to do more in the future. You can follow me on Twitter and Instagram and subscribe to my channel by clicking here. You can watch another video by clicking here. You can check out my Patreon here and in the description down below. Thanks for the... how did I mess that up? We're literally at the end of the video. I haven't got one wrong take yet, and then you do that. Seriously, what are you doing? Thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.